Grazie Claire. Signore e signori, buonasera. Sono lieta di stare con voi. And that is about the limit of my Italian, I'm sorry to say. But it's just a joy to be here with Valentina tonight and with you to celebrate her publication, Mestri di Mont, which I'm sure you already know about. I had never heard of Tito Maniacco before I met Valentina, and I'm now very interested in him as a figure and as a writer and painter and poet. His poetry in particular remains a mystery for me, but I'm very interested in learning more about it in future. But for now, our subject is Mestri di Mont and Valentina's translation of this book. So we thought we would begin tonight by inviting Valentina to give a very short reading. She'll give 2 or 3 of these through the conversation that we're having, but she's just going to give a short reading to get us started. Valentina, I think we're going to read from the beginning of the book when Tito begins sets out on his teaching journey.
Yes. So it's pretty much at the beginning of the book, pages 18, 19. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. I took the bus, and after wandering around the corridors and knocking on the various doors of the primary school, I found myself in front of an elegant woman jingling with bracelets, who told me she was the principal. After checking my paperwork and verifying it against hers, she nonchalantly offloaded me to the secretary, returning to what I had abruptly interrupted. And that was my first encounter with the school system. The secretary, a minute Carnian with kind blue eyes, enveloped in a stern black smock in the style of Demetrio Pianelli, alias Akakia Kakjevic, told me in a grave tone, laced in a subtle and perverse irony, "Mr. Teacher, sir, did you think you would be stopping here with us?" On one hand, the question had the tone of an easy conquest on home turf. On the other, of the philosophical concept that hard work must occur in order to gain experience. Working your way up through the ranks, as one would say to the frightened recruits who presented themselves at the regiment. Well, no, that's not how it is. She fell silent, waiting for my acquiescent response, which did not come. Green eyes silently watched blue eyes. Well, do you know what assigned to the school office means? No, I did not know. The lands of school bureaucracy were unknown lands, hic sunt leonis. Well, she said, it means that you, sir, and those like you are nothing more than substitutes for absent teachers. And it has worked out well for you. You have a permanent teaching position, but as a substitute. So you, sir, can now get on your way to Morgesa. Now? She looked at me with the reproach that a Carnian work ethic dictated in response to even a hint of hesitation when it came to hard work. If not now, then when? Those children have been waiting for a teacher for a week, so you need to get up there and do your job.
Thank you. That sets the tone for Tito's adventures as a teacher. His very first teaching post in quite unusual circumstances from a modern point of view, but a source of inspiration, I think, for the rest of his life, as we'll see. So I think we should begin, Valentina, with the question, who was Tito Maniacco? Why is he important? Tell us a little bit about him.
So the local papers not that long ago actually said he was the last of the communist intellectuals. He was born in 1932 and died in 2010. And growing up, he spent a lot of time with writers and poets and artists, and eventually he became one himself. So he was probably best known for his writing. He wrote history of Friuli, history of Udine, But he was also the writer of novels. He wrote poetry, as already mentioned. He wrote 2 memoirs, and he wrote quite a lot of social criticism for the left-wing newspapers. And you may have guessed from the surname that he was related to me, and he was an uncle that I never met. So that's who he is in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you so much. So my next question really kind of flows on from that. I mean, you've given us a clue now that there was a personal connection between the two of you. But how did you ever, I think you didn't really know much about him, and in a sense, coming to write about him was a bit of a surprise. So how did it happen? How did you end up writing about him?
So that one's a bit of a long story, so settle in. It's probably about 9 years ago, I decided that I needed to improve my rudimentary Italian, and at the suggestion of a friend of mine who was teaching at the Dante on the Gold Coast, she encouraged me to go to Griffith University and study Italian. So I did, and there was a subject that we did called spoken Italian. And what they do in that subject is you've got to practice your Italian, so they put you in contact with an Italian community member and you meet with them on a regular basis. Part of that exercise is you've got to write things about those meetings, but you've also got to do a presentation right at the end on something to do with either the city, the region, or something about where your community member comes from. And my community member happened to come from Udine, which is my family's hometown. So I thought, okay, what will I do my presentation on? And one of the things that's quite unusual about Friuli is that half the population speak a different language. They speak Friulian. And so I thought, great, this will be the focus of my presentation to the class. And I thought, okay, I know nothing about the history of Friuli, I better find out. And I did what we would all do. I jumped on to Google and went, books, breve storia del Friuli. So books, brief history of Friuli. And what came up ended up changing my life. So as I scrolled down through all of these books, there was this one that jumped out at me, and it said Amazon.it, Breve Storia del Friuli, Tito Maniacco. And I'm thinking, that's exactly what I've Googled, and somebody's written a book with exactly that same name, and oh my God, Tito Maniacco. And it was followed by another one, Storia del Friuli, Tito Maniacco Goodreads. And I'm thinking, this is too much of a coincidence. I know my father had a brother in Udine, whose name was Tito, and I thought it's got to be him. And so my talk to the class ended up taking a bit of a turn, and I ended up presenting on this person, a famous person from Friuli, who happened to be an uncle I never knew. So, that explains quite a surprising set of connections and some good fortune in that journey, because perhaps, it might not have been the case if your community member had been from another region, who knows? But maybe in the end you would have found Tito anyway. But you did. And in exploring his life, and thinking about your doctoral research, you managed to bring the two together in a way that has been extremely successful, and not just successful but also a very creative endeavour. So I'm hoping a bit later in the discussion we can talk a bit about you as a writer, but for the moment what I'm really interested in finding out, that I think will interest the audience, is why you chose Mestri di Mont. Of all of the works of his that are published, why this was the one that drew you in to translate? I didn't actually find Mestri di Mont, I think it found me. there's a bit of a story behind that. I had gone to Italy in 2015, and I'd gone to meet my cousin Barbara, who was Tito's daughter, and I'd found her through the director of the library, who, when I was doing that presentation for Griffith Uni, he had kindly sent me a whole heap of information about my uncle, and he said, you need to contact his daughter. And so 2015, I'd gone over there, I did meet her, and I thought, I need to take this opportunity and thank the director of the library for, one, giving me all the information he did, but also putting me in contact with my cousin, because I have no other relatives in Australia. And anyway, when I was sitting with him having a chat, I'd told him that I'd finished my diploma in Italian, that I'd finished an honours project, and that project involved a translation of a contemporary story. And he said, oh, if you're thinking of doing some more translating, maybe you should think about translating one of your uncle's books. And he suggested Mestri di Mont to me, because he said that it was an endearing story and might be quite suitable. So, but at the time, I wasn't thinking of doing any more translating. I just thought, no, I've just done this, enough. But fast forward 2 years, so 2017, and I was back in Udine, and I was looking for what might be my next project. And I'd been visiting with my aunt, Barbara's mother, my cousin's mother, Louisa, and as I was leaving, she gave me a book and said, this is one of my favourite books, it's out of print, you should read it. And anyway, you can guess which book it was. It was Mestri di Mont, which in fact is this one. This is what she gave me, which is the original version. And I did read it. It took about a week while I was there. I read through it, and as soon as I finished it, I knew I wanted to translate it. So basically the rest is history.
Thank you very much. So again, a nice segue between research, study, personal history, and people advising and guiding you along the way, including the discovery of family members that you've never met before, which I think has been a very rewarding experience in many ways for you, from what I hear. So, Mestri di Mont was one component of Valentina's PhD dissertation, and it's been published, as you know, by Forum, and that came out even before Valentina completed her thesis. But the thesis itself was quite a lot bigger than just this text, and it explores some interesting cultural history aspects, looking at the context, the social context in which Tito Maniacco was writing, but also the question of translation and how Valentina proceeded with that, the challenges that she faced in particular. And I mean, I'm not a translator, but I'm always very interested in what choices, particularly in creative writing, somebody makes when they translate a work from one language to another. So one of my questions for you tonight, Valentina, is what were the primary challenges that you faced in translating this book?
Well, it's always a challenge when you're replacing the words of someone else, because when a writer writes, obviously all of their words are carefully chosen, and here I am about to rewrite them. So that's a challenge in itself. But there were 3 distinct challenges to translating the book, and I wrote about these in my thesis. The book was written in Italian, but there was lots of Friulian embedded in the book. And that's primarily because in the village where he was teaching, they spoke their own version of Friulian. So there's plenty of Friulian in the book. There's a smattering of French and Latin in the book. And so the first challenge I had was, okay, recognising the shifts in language. And, you know, you might think, okay, it's easy to recognise Italian versus French versus Latin, but sometimes there were little things that tricked me and it wasn't so obvious what the shifts were. The other thing I had to work out is how to handle the different languages. So I ended up deciding all of the Italian would be translated into English, and then I would leave all of the other languages as per the original. So the Friulian appears, you know, when you see the book, there's Friulian throughout. The Latin and French is still in the book. And what I chose to do was use footnotes to explain what those things meant if Tito hadn't explained them, because a lot of the time he explains it as part of his story. He throws in a Friulian phrase and then he'll explain what that is. So of course I did that in English, but if he didn't, there was a lot of assumed knowledge because he assumed his readers would be from Friuli. So what was assumed, I added footnotes and explained. So there was that challenge. And then he has a particular style which many Italians find difficult. I was told he likes to experiment with his writing. So by experimenting, I mean he didn't add punctuation. So there would be really long paragraphs that were one sentence, and the first bit of punctuation is the full stop at the end. And so it was extremely difficult to try and render that in English. So what I ended up doing was I would cut those long paragraphs into chunks, smaller sentences, and I did that even to clarify meaning for myself, because there were times when some of the paragraphs I couldn't get my head around, what is he saying in here? Like, it's dense. And anyway, the cutting up of the paragraph helped me. And then what I did through each iteration because, you know, I went through it a million times, I would go back to those broken up sentences and see if I could make the sentences lengthy again to represent what he was doing, but still make sense in English. So I ended up adding punctuation and sometimes turning a sentence around so that it worked better in English.
Can I interrupt you for a moment? I know you'll go on with this answer to my question, but as a writer I find it very interesting hearing you talk about that, because in a sense what you're trying to do is reverse engineer a creative process, which he's deliberately used in a kind of modernist style to create kind of a set of impressions, and you're in a sense, you know, breaking that down, making it coherent, and then trying to kind of give us just a sense of that, but in a slightly easier, more accessible way in the English version. But there is another thing about that I wanted to explore, which is one of the things I thought might be very challenging, is the way he uses a great deal of metaphor. And metaphor in Italian doesn't always translate in English. And I just wondered if there were any examples of things that you found difficult or easy to...
Look, there's one paragraph that will never leave me. And I can't remember all of the words in the paragraph, but I do remember that I must have reworked it over and over and over because it didn't make sense for a long time. And then when I really tried to put it back together with, less punctuation, I thought, it doesn't work, it doesn't make sense. I ended up having to explain the metaphor in a footnote, which I know is probably giving up, but it was just such a difficult paragraph. And so what he'd done is he'd used cheese making as a metaphor for language making. So he was talking about how the Friulian language had developed over the centuries, and he was using cheese as this metaphor, and it was really difficult to make that clear. And one of the things that I really wanted to do with the translation was make sure that nothing was lost. And I thought, okay, I've done my best with this paragraph, but I need to add something in the footnote. And I did. I spoke about how he's used cheese as a metaphor for language making.
Which is a very honourable solution to a complex problem, because he wanted to be faithful, but also to explain to the English reader what he was trying to do. So I appreciate that, yes.
Yeah.
But there was a third chapter, wasn't there?
Yes, oh my God. His work, it's not just Mestri di Mont, but in all of his work, he includes loads of references and allusions, but loads of references to other books, to authors, to poetry, to songs, to philosophy, to historical events, historical people. And it's not just a smattering, it's almost every page. And I mean, it's almost like I had to go and do the work for another book to understand all of those references, because I have a completely different cultural background to what he had. So, you know, I hadn't read the same books, I didn't know the same history, and so it was a real learning process for me. And the way I tackled it again was I used footnotes. So I didn't want my reader to have the same issues. When I was reading something, I'm going, what does this character mean? What's he trying to say here? And I'd go and look up, who's the character? What's he intending with this? And I go, oh, that's what he means. Okay, well, I won't destroy his text, but I'll just add a little note so that my reader doesn't have to go, you know, what's he saying here?
Yes,
So,
excellent. Okay, great. So I think it would be a really good time now for us to have another short extract. And I think the one that you were thinking of reading at this point is when Tito arrives at the school, or a little bit after he arrives at the school, and has a kind of experience of what it's like to be there.
So this is when he first walks into the classroom. And bear in mind, I know I haven't given you a synopsis of the book, but it's about his first teaching experience. So he's been assigned to this one classroom school in a remote village, high in the mountains of Friuli, the Pre-Alps. He's got 17 children he's teaching, and it's classes 1 to 5. So he's got this mixed bag of children, and this excerpt's from when he first walks into the classroom. So, on a sturdy platform stood an enormous desk the colour of rosewood, no doubt due to the use of a stain, with a dark surface that projected out from the parallelepiped-shaped base by a hand's width or so, and which stood directly under a mournful light bulb with a white porcelain backing plate. I stepped onto the platform and noticed that everything was clean and well maintained, in the way that property of the state can look poor but dignified. The class register exactly in the centre, always that symmetry. In front of it, a green enamel pen holder that contained a shiny inkwell, a stack of textbooks on the right and another of readers on the left. I sat down and saw that the line of sight was good, because the height of the chair allowed me to see along the waves bearing those black vessels, the desks over which appeared the smiling faces of the children, who in my excitement I judged to be bellissimi, beautiful. Those children who were looking at me smiling cheerfully, hair hurriedly tidied with a wet comb, were beautiful because emanating from their carefully patched clothes and scarpettes came a kind of quiet dignity that sparkled from their eyes and spread like an aura around them. They looked me straight in the eyes as if to say, "This is us. We're here. Do you care about us? What will you teach us today? What stories will you tell us?" Hungry as they were for stories and fairy tales. They were curious about the world, but they were not dependent on it. They knew what they knew, and reading and writing were activities lying outside the normal course of their lives, which ran between plots of corn, beans, potatoes, some goats that they cared for all day, pigs and a few cows. Without electricity, they had neither cinema nor television, and the news was filtered through the only existing battery-operated radio, owned by an old man who had been given it by his son, along with the necessary information on how to buy and replace the batteries. None of them had ever seen a combustion engine, and the only plane was the one that flew overhead, coming from who knows where and going who knows where. The priest came on Sundays for Mass, and for that small dose of doctrine, empirically considered sufficient for Holy Communion. The allocated community doctor visited them once a year, and from time to time, the Alpine troop patrols on their training marches, along with a couple of mules, would stop by. The only certainty was the teacher, who was with them 10 months a year.
Thank you, that was beautiful. He makes it seem timeless in a way. And I guess the only thing I can relate to about it in a way is when I was, many decades ago, when I was a small child, I briefly attended a school like this in the country with grades through grade 1 to 7. And I think the way a teacher approaches that has to be completely different. You can't just teach a straight curriculum. You have to think about all of the students working both together and individually at different levels. And it seems to me that you use storytelling a lot to try and make common ground between them and to build on it. And he was actually a very innovative teacher and really quite a radical thinker. And much of that came out of his experience teaching here, I think, when he began to think about what it meant to be in a community, what it meant to learn, to know things about the world, what mattered, what knowledge really mattered and didn't matter. A fascinating, in a sense, educational philosophy. I many years ago taught educational philosophy, and I wish I'd known this book at the time. But there's another question I wanted to ask you, Valentina, and it's sort of two questions. So I'm going to ask you one question you weren't expecting and one question you were expecting. The question that, in general, is really about what you found was special about the experience of learning about Tito Maniacco and then translating his book. But I particularly wanted to begin that by asking you, in what sense did this become a work of creative writing? Or what in sense did your thesis become, in part, a work of creative writing, as well as scholarship?
Didn't start off that way,
No.
as you know. I changed course about a year in, probably when Stephanie joined my supervision team. My intention originally was to write about Tito more biographically and to translate his book. But part of the experience was interviewing people who knew him, and I still remember the day that Stephanie said to me, what I'd like you to do is write me a story. And I'm thinking, write me a story? And she said, yeah, write me a story each week. Why don't you just, those people you've interviewed, why don't you write me a story about that interview? And I'm thinking, okay. And, she was very kind. She said, just 500 words, not a lot. And I thought, I can do this, that's okay. And so I started writing the interviews as creative stories. So I included the things that people had told me, but I wrapped a story around it. So I remember probably the one that's most memorable is the director of the library when I went and spoke to him. And, he's in the cavern of the library, and this room was amazing. The light came in, he was behind a desk, and there were the ceiling had to be 3 to 4 metres high, and there were bookcases all the way up. And, he had these 2 portraits of elderly gentlemen looking down at him. And anyway, I wrote this story about him, and I remember each week as I sent Stephanie these stories, they got longer and longer and longer. The first one started off pretty short, but I think by the last one I was sending her a couple of thousand words, which is probably getting sick of reading them. But it changed the way I looked at what I was writing, because in the end we used a lot of that material in my thesis. So there was quite a lot of creative writing embedded. in. Have I answered your
You
question?
have answered that question, but I'm thinking we'll continue to explore this question in different ways over the next few minutes. What were the other special things you gained from doing this work, this project? Were there any particular things that you got from it or that you drew from it that you really cherish at this point?
There was several things. I mean, one is clearly I started to see myself differently. So initially, I spent a year translating that book. It was hard work for me. It was a level of Italian that was a huge leap for my Italian. So that was really difficult. But then when I started writing, and I was writing about the things I learned about Tito, the things I learned about myself and my family's history, I was writing all this down. And over time, I started to see a transition in myself. I wasn't just translating work anymore. I was writing. I was doing creative writing, which I'd never done before. And so there was a transition there of how I saw myself, and I wrote about that. But the other thing that I got out of the whole project was a closeness with my family that I never had. My parents emigrated to Australia. It was just the two of them, so we had no other relatives. And all of a sudden I was discovering these people in Italy that were my family. So that was a wonderful thing. And I got to learn a lot about my father, because my father died when I was quite young, and I didn't get to explore anything about his family with him. So I learned a whole heap of things about him through his brother's work. Tito wrote 2 memoirs, and the other one has a lot of my father in it. So I learned a lot about my family. I learned a lot about writing. What else would I? They're probably the 2 major things that I took away.
Yeah, I think it's been very obvious from my experience of working with you that you've flourished in both in that sense of gaining a sort of new family, new old family, but also I developed a connection to Friuli. Like I can now go to Udine and wander the streets, and I know my way around. I've been now a couple of times. I've had to go, when I had to interview people, I had to find my way to wherever they were. One of the people I interviewed was the ex-mayor, who is now on the regional council. And so, that was a very official meeting in an official building. But I feel like Friuli is a place, well, maybe not Friuli, maybe Udine is a place I know quite well, the centre of Udine. But I also went and did the trek. So if I talk, here we go, there's a couple of pictures. So Tito would travel twice a week to Mogessa, where he taught. It was a 1-hour train ride from Udine to Moggio, which is the town at the base of the mountain. And then it was a 2-hour trek up the 418 mountain path, which I did. It took me 2 hours to get up there. It's 2 kilometres. So, and I'm not that unfit, don't laugh, Renee. But it was like this. It was up and down, and I couldn't have done it. I took those Nordic walking poles with me. I couldn't have done it without them, because coming down, I had to use them to stop me from falling. It was so difficult, and I think he used to do that twice a week. But I have a connection now with the place. Absolutely.
So that's one of the things I took away.
Were there any other really intriguing people you met, remarkable people that stay with you to this day?
So many. It was a really wonderful experience. I actually got to meet lots of people with the interviewing that I did, but also people who helped me along the way. So I mentioned to you that there's a lot of Friulian in the book. And one of the difficulties I had was that the Friulian dictionaries that are available are underdeveloped. So they weren't that helpful. They were okay for a word here, a word there, but when there were phrases, it was really hard to work out exactly what they meant. And so I was really lucky that I met this wonderful man who has just retired, but he was the deputy principal of the Convito in Cividale in Friuli, and his knowledge of Friulan is amazing. And I pestered him so much. I owe him big time when I go back, but I was constantly asking him questions about the Friulian. And, you know, he was so kind, you know, with his time. He wouldn't just tell me it means this in Italian and so then I'd go, okay, I can put that into English. He would tell me the history behind, you know, a phrase. You know, he gave me a whole spiel. And I'd think, oh my God, this guy is so busy and yet he's taking the time to write to me and explain these things. So he had a huge input, but still there's just one person I want to add, somebody I never met. And these are the funny things that happened while I was translating, people who would come out of the woodwork and help me out. And there was this little detail in the book that I wanted to clarify. There's one chapter where Tito comes to collect his first paycheck, and he's got to come down the mountain, go into the town of Moggia, find the post office and collect his pay. When he gets to the bottom of the track, he notices that it's nearly 5 o'clock and he's got to hurry up before the post office closes. And what I was trying to work out is, it's not clear, how did he know it was about to be 5 o'clock? Because he was talking about the bell tower of the church. And I thought, does the bell tower have a clock on it? Or does he know from the bells that are going to toll? Oh, I need to know this so that I can translate it correctly. And so I sent an email to the Municipal Council of Moggia and said, don't know if there's anyone who can help me with this, but I'm translating Tito Maniacco's Mestri di Mont. I need clarification on something. This fellow writes me back and he said, oh, I read Mestri di Mont when it came out. I loved the book. Anything I can do to help you, let me know. And I thought, wow. Anyway, he went off to the archives because there were 2 devastating earthquakes in Friuli in 1976, and Moggia was very close to one of the epicenters, so a lot of the town was destroyed. Anyway, he went and got maps of previous to the earthquakes, you know, what did the town look like, where was the post office, where were the churches, and he came back to me and said there was 3 churches in the village, but if we retrace his footsteps, and he got to the end of the path, right at the top of Moggia, top of the town, the only church he could have seen was this one, and it doesn't have a clock face, so it was the bells. And so, you know, and like, seriously, this is a little detail that's 4 words in the book.
Authenticity.
But I needed to know, I wanted to get it right, and I was really lucky. I came across somebody who was really keen to help me. So that was, you know, I'll never forget that. It was wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great story. We're running sort of a little over time now, so what I thought we might do is cut to the next reading.
Okay.
And then we'll just tie off with a few last words.
All right. Okay, so Tito used to go on, Tito would live in the village for most of the week. So obviously once school was out, he was still around, and often he would go on excursions with the kids through the forest, around the mountains. So this is one of the excursions. We sat in silence until I asked with an air of boredom, and now? Well, answered Anute judgmentally. First you must tell me, sir, what time is now? I didn't bother to correct her and said 4:30. If it's 4:30, well, we should see something down there now, at the bottom. Don't look up high, sir, look down low. But down low was a dense tangle of vibrant corpuscles of fog and darkness. No one spoke, and we could not see anything until Berto, the impatient one, prompted me. And now? One could have answered ironically, like the many times they had answered me as a child. And now is the same time as it was yesterday at this time. Or more simply, that I'd said the same thing 3 minutes prior, but I remained silent until a long intake of breath by the club band, the gang, announced the appearance in the specified area of a speeding steam train, with the sound of its whistle bouncing along the slopes of the mountains, then being engulfed by the darkness. The children anxiously followed the quick appearance and even quicker disappearance, until only a slow, lazy, horizontal trail of low white wisps of smoke from the steam engine remained to mark its passage. In silence, we climbed the steep slope, leaving the knoll, which for a moment had been our great theatre of the world, our globe, our spectacular performance of the mechanical miracles of the modern world.
Thank you.
It was one of his illusions, the globe.
The globe. We are getting a little bit further on in our time than we had planned to, but we do have one more thing we wanted to show you this evening, which is a short video, which I think will kind of put all of this into perspective.
I'll give you a little bit of background. It's not to do with Mestri di Mont, but one of the last books of poetry that my uncle wrote was called Oltris, and it is Italian and Friulian poetry. And this is taken at a festival where the book was launched, and somebody is reading one of the poems, but it's quite lovely, so I thought I'd share it. It's just a snippet, and it includes his artwork.
Oltris, disse San Cristoforo, mentre guardava l'impetuoso Lumiei, che gli antichi chiamavano fra i bianchi monti. Oltris, disse San Cristoforo al bambin Gesù che portava sulle spalle, Oltris è il più bel paese del mondo. Disse San Cristoforo al bambin Gesù, ripeti. E il bambin Gesù gridò con voce squillante, Oltris è il più bel paese del mondo. Disse San Cristoforo, Oltris è il più bel paese del mondo. Ripeti. E il bambin Gesù gridò con voce squillante, Oltris è il più bel paese del mondo.
Oltris è il più bel paese del mondo. Oltris è il più bel paese del mondo. Oltris è il più bel paese del mondo. Oltris è il più bel paese del mondo.
Town in Friuli, and he used to spend a lot of time there and wrote his poetry and did a lot of his watercolours there. And my cousin gifted me the apple trees that are in the last still, so I've got that one at home, which is really nice. Yeah, really nice.
Thank you very much, Valentina. It's been wonderful to be in conversation with you. I have other questions, but I think this is a good moment for us to open the questions to the floor and to invite you to join us in the conversation if you'd like to do that. If you do ask a question, could I ask you to speak loudly so that it's recorded for the video?
Sorry, Stephanie.
Please.
Maybe there may be some Friuli in the audience. Maybe we could have first question from someone. Friulano.
Well, there are two questions in the middle. Let's start with those and then come back to the Friulani. Can I get the gentleman in black and then the gentleman with the check shirt? So we'll go in that order, yes.
My question is for Valentina. After you've done all this hard work, if that inspired you to write your own book, and what is it about?
What a good question.
Would you state the question?
So I was asked whether this has inspired me to write my own book.
Very good question.
And I have to say, Stephanie hints at this all the time as well.
I'm on your case.
Because a lot of my thesis was quite personal. There was a mixture of my story, like I said, my story, Tito's story, and a bit of academic writing all sort of thrown in the mix. And there was a lot that I left out of the thesis because it's only allowed to be so many words. And so I have been thinking that I would love to take some of the stories that I wrote of other people I interviewed and maybe grow some of the chapters that were quite personal and write about the experience, because it was quite a unique experience.
Thank you. We'll go to you.
Valentina, during one of our lessons on Passato Remoto, you mentioned that it's very rarely used in spoken Italian, but you mentioned that one of the interviews you did
Oh my God,
used
yes.
that. So was it the ex-mayor that you interviewed?
No, thank goodness he didn't do that to me. No, one of the fellows who knew my uncle, who was also a writer himself, he's written books on history, and he's cited quite a lot through my thesis because I used a lot of the material. He also gave me one of the poems that Tito had written after the earthquakes. So he was very helpful. But when I interviewed him at the Friulian Society, the Philologica, La Philologica, is that right? The Philological Society in Friuli. I interviewed him there. And the whole interview, and I spoke to him for almost 2 hours, but the whole time he spoke in Passato Remoto. And it killed me. I mean, I understood everything he said, it wasn't a problem, but I was just so shocked because I've never spoken to anyone who's used Passato Remoto in spoken language. So it was really bizarre, but I thought, oh, okay, he wants to make me understand how literate he is, but it was bizarre.
Please hear.
What did Tito do during the war?
He was a child during the war.
He was a teenager, and you said he was a communist.
Yes.
So what impact did the war have on his life?
On his life, well, I think the war, maybe not so much the war, but the people the partisans who were involved in fighting against the fascists. I know his father used to deliver messages in secret because they had curfews, and because his father was an artist, he was quite a famous photographer in Friuli, and he was allowed to travel at night. So I know that in his bicycle he used to spread the word to whoever he needed to spread the word to. So I can imagine there was quite an impact on him. He used to hang out with left-wing artists and writers, so clearly that was a big influence on him. What else can I say?
That's right. Yes,
Yeah.
a question up the back.
Having spent a year translating a book from Italian to English, what do you think the challenges would be translating a book from English into Italian?
I really think you need to translate into your mother tongue, because I wouldn't attempt to translate from English into Italian. I do believe you've got to do it to your mother tongue.
Or
So
have
there'd be similar
fluency.
challenges, you
Equivalent
know.
fluency.
Yeah, but you would have to be, you know, extremely fluent. You know, and I've never lived in Italy. My Italian is, I think it's excellent. Is it excellent? Yes. I think my Italian's pretty good, but I've never lived there. I grew up in Australia and my cultural heritage is Australian. So there's so much missing. So I would never attempt the other way. I might translate my own work either way, but I wouldn't attempt to translate somebody else's.
So when you write, you write in English, but do you hear it in Italian as well?
For me, it depends where I am. So one thing I have noticed is when I go to Italy, it takes me about a week, and then I start thinking in Italian, dreaming in Italian. Italian becomes second nature. When I'm here, not so much. But what I do notice is when I hang out with these people, with the people from the Dante, it comes back. You know, I just need to be immersed in Italian, and you know, you switch, something in your brain switches.
All right, thank you. Are there any more questions?
Yes.
Yes, one up the back here.
I noticed there are French and Latin allusions in Tito's book. You referred to Friuli, which I can understand. I just wondered how the French and the Latin got into his references in his story.
Yes, he was a very cultured, well-read person. In fact, the politicians that I interviewed all said to me, you never want to get into a debate with him because he was so well-read. He knew the history, he knew politics, he was a Marxist, and he was so well-read that you would always lose a debate. So you had to be extremely careful.
And presumably he'd studied French and Latin.
Yeah, he had studied, he had a French tutor growing up. He had a very unusual childhood that he took himself out of school because he decided that he wasn't learning what he needed to learn and took himself off to the library and self-taught. So an unusual upbringing.
Well, listen, I think we're kind of drawing to the close of our time now. But I want to thank Valentina very much from the bottom of my heart, not only for giving us this great rendition of her work, about her work, but also for the opportunity to work with her. And I must extend my gratitude to Claire Kennedy, who has been the most amazing colleague to work with. I've worked with Claire not just in the context of Valentina's thesis, but also in a shared leadership role. And I have to say it was a remarkable opportunity, a joy, and will be perhaps one of the most rewarding of my career. So thank you, Claire. And thanks to all of you for being here this evening, for partaking in the discussion.
Can I add one thing?
And now I'm going to hand over to Valentina to finish with a few remarks.
I just want to add one thing. We've spoken tonight a little bit about Mestri di Mont and a bit about my thesis as well. And we talked about the wonderful people in Italy who helped me, you know, sort of without even blinking an eye. They were just there to help. But I couldn't have done this without Claire and Stephanie. Griffith University is a worse place for the fact that you two are no longer there, because I couldn't have chosen better supervisors. I was so lucky. I had wonderful support. They were always willing to give me plenty of time. And, you know, I still remember all of those meetings Claire and I used to have at the Avid Reader in in West End where we'd be sitting there and I'd be going, but I think this means that. And she'd go, no, but I think it's this. And we'd tear paragraphs apart debating on, you know, what's the right meaning. And, you know, sometimes I'd have to resort to people in Italy to clarify things. But I had so much input from both of them. And as I said, my thesis took a turn when Stephanie came on board because she had this creative writing slant, and I never thought I would be writing in that way. I never saw myself in the light of a creative writer. So thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.